The sound of sirens pierced through the morning air as police cars surrounded the pristine white chapel. Wedding guests scattered like startled birds, their champagne glasses crashing to the marble steps. Inside, a bride in an expensive Vera Wang gown stood frozen at the altar, her face pale as her dress, while handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The groom, still in his tuxedo, watched in horror as his new wife was read her rights for grand theft, identity fraud, and embezzlement totaling over $3 million. But this wasn't just any wedding day disaster. This story will restore your faith in justice because the real bride, the woman he'd divorced just hours earlier, stood in the back of the chapel, smiling serenely as she watched her ex-husband's world crumble. She had orchestrated every single moment of this spectacular downfall, and nobody, not even the FBI agents making the arrest, knew just how deep her revenge went. Margaret Chen had always been the type of person who remembered birthdays, brought soup to sick neighbors, and kept every promise she ever made. At 42, she worked as a pediatric nurse at Boston Children's Hospital, spending 12-hour shifts caring for the smallest, most vulnerable patients. Her colleagues often joked that she had healing hands, the way colicky babies would stop crying the moment she held them, how frightened children would trust her instantly with their deepest fears about surgeries and treatments. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants who ran a small restaurant in Chinatown, Margaret learned early that hard work and integrity were the foundations of a good life. Her father, Chen Wei, would tell her stories while she helped fold wontons after school. May, remember that character is like jade. It becomes more beautiful under pressure, but it never breaks. Her mother, Lin, taught her that patience was a virtue that always rewarded those who practiced it. Good things come to those who plant seeds and tend the garden, even when others try to steal the harvest. Margaret's one weakness had always been her trusting nature. She saw the best in people, sometimes to her own detriment, but her strength, the thing that made her exceptional, was her memory. She remembered every conversation, every promise, every small kindness or cruelty. It was what made her such an excellent nurse, anticipating patients' needs before they voiced them. It was also what would make her the architect of the most elaborate revenge Boston had ever witnessed. She had met David Kellerman 15 years earlier when he was a struggling investment advisor, and she was a young nurse paying off student loans. He was charming, ambitious, and treated her like she was the most important person in his world. They married after 2 years of courtship, in a small ceremony at her parents' restaurant, surrounded by the smell of jasmine tea and the sound of her grandmother's blessing in Mandarin. David had seemed like the perfect husband for 10 years. He supported her career, praised her dedication to her patients, and often said he was lucky to have married someone with such a generous heart. But success changed him. As his investment firm grew and his client list expanded to include some of Boston's wealthiest families, David began to see Margaret differently. Her simple pleasures, tending their small garden, reading to hospitalized children on weekends, her weekly dinners with her aging parents, suddenly seemed embarrassing to him. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started with small comments. Maybe you could wear something more sophisticated to the firm's Christmas party. Then, do you have to talk about your patients so much? People want to hear about interesting things. Finally, Margaret, you're a wonderful person, but you just don't fit into this world I'm building. 3 years ago, Margaret had come home early from the hospital after a particularly difficult day. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez had been her patient for months, fighting leukemia with the fierce determination that only children possess. That afternoon, Emma had taken a turn for the worse, and Margaret had held her mother's hand while they waited for test results that would determine if Emma would need an emergency bone marrow transplant. She found David in his home office, on a video call with someone she didn't recognize, a stunning blonde woman who was laughing at something he'd said. Margaret noticed he was wearing the cologne she'd given him for their anniversary, the one he usually saved for special occasions. When he saw her in the doorway, his expression shifted from intimate warmth to cold annoyance. "I thought you were working late," he said, ending the call abruptly. "Emma might need emergency surgery. I couldn't concentrate, so Dr. Peterson sent me home." She moved closer to his desk, noticing he'd closed his laptop quickly. "Who were you talking to?" "A client. Someone considering a major investment. You wouldn't understand the details." The dismissal in his voice stung more than usual because of her already raw emotional state. "Margaret, I need to prepare for tomorrow's presentation. Could you give me some space?" She nodded and backed out of the room, but something felt wrong. In 15 years together, David had never made her feel unwelcome in any part of their home. That night, She lay awake listening to him type emails until nearly 2 in the morning, a habit that had become increasingly common. The second pivotal moment came 18 months later at David's firm's annual gala. Margaret had spent weeks finding the perfect dress, a navy blue silk number that complemented her figure without being too flashy. She'd even splurged on professional styling for her hair and makeup, wanting to make David proud. The evening started well enough. David introduced her to clients and colleagues, his hand warm on the small of her back. But as the night progressed, she noticed him gravitating toward a group of younger associates and their dates, women who worked in fashion, real estate, or marketing. Women who laughed loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny and who seemed to effortlessly command attention. Margaret found herself standing alone by the silent auction table, pretending to study the listed prizes while straining to hear David's conversation across the room. That's when she overheard Victoria Whitmore, the wife of one of David's major clients, talking to another woman. "That's David Kellerman's wife," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying just enough for Margaret to hear. "She's a nurse. Sweet, I suppose, but terribly provincial. David's going places. I can't imagine she'll keep up much longer. Men like him usually trade up when they reach a certain level." The other woman laughed. "Starter wives rarely make it past the first million, do they?" Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to remain composed. She spent the rest of the evening observing more carefully, noting how David's colleagues treated her with polite indifference, how their wives included her in conversations only when politeness demanded it. She was an outsider in David's new world, and apparently everyone could see it except her. That night, she started paying closer attention to David's behavior, his schedule, his phone calls. It wasn't suspicion yet, just a growing awareness that the man she'd married was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw her as a liability rather than a partner. David Kellerman, at 45, had transformed from the humble man Margaret married into something else entirely. His investment firm, Kellerman & Associates, managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. He drove a Tesla Model S, wore custom-tailored suits, and belonged to 3 exclusive clubs. His corner office on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise overlooked Boston Harbor, and his assistant, a efficient woman named Carol, who'd been with the firm for 8 years, guarded his time like a dragon protecting treasure. But David's success had come with a price that went beyond the long hours and constant pressure. He developed what his therapist, a detail Margaret would discover later, called affluenza, a compulsive need to surround himself with status symbols and people who reflected his new self-image. Margaret, with her sensible clothes and earnest dedication to sick children, no longer fit that image. His vulnerability, the crack in his polished armor, was his desperate need for validation from his wealthy clients. David had grown up middle class in Worcester, the son of a high school math teacher and a part-time bookkeeper. His hunger for acceptance from old-money Boston families drove him to make increasingly risky decisions, both professionally and personally. He would do almost anything to prove he belonged in their world, including betraying the woman who had supported him through years of struggle. The other players in this unfolding drama were carefully positioned around David and Margaret's deteriorating marriage like chess pieces waiting to be moved. There was James Morrison, David's business partner, a sharp-eyed man who'd always liked Margaret and noticed the changes in David with growing concern. Carol Hendricks, David's assistant, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the personal calls she was asked to screen and the lies she was expected to tell. Margaret's closest ally was her colleague Dr. Sarah Peterson, the chief of pediatric oncology, who had worked alongside Margaret for 7 years and recognized her exceptional intuition about people and situations. There was also Margaret's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rose Delacroix, a spry 83-year-old former private investigator who had moved to Boston after retiring from a 40-year career in New York. Mrs. Delacroix had an uncanny ability to notice things others missed and a network of contacts that spanned decades. The most crucial player, though one Margaret didn't yet know about, was Elena Rodriguez, not Emma's mother, but a woman who had been using that name along with several others. Elena was actually Isabella Marquez, a sophisticated con artist who had been wanted by federal authorities for 3 years. She specialized in targeting successful, insecure men who craved validation. Her method was always the same: extensive research, a carefully crafted persona, a whirlwind romance, and then systematic financial exploitation before disappearing without a trace. David had no idea he was her next mark. The first micro-humiliation came on a Tuesday evening in March. Margaret arrived home from a particularly challenging shift to find David entertaining clients in their living room. The space she had carefully decorated with family photos, her grandmother's antique tea set, and plants she'd nurtured for years. The clients, a wealthy couple named the Astors, were examining a framed photo of Margaret receiving an award for her work with pediatric cancer patients. "How quaint," Mrs. Astor said, her tone suggesting Margaret's achievement was roughly equivalent to winning a participation trophy at an elementary school field day. "David, you never mentioned your wife was so hands-on with her career." David's laugh was uncomfortable. "Margaret is very dedicated to her work. Sometimes I think she cares more about her patients than she does about anything else." The way he said it made Margaret's calling sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. "Well, Mr. Astor interjected, "I suppose someone has to do those jobs, though I can't imagine choosing to spend one's days around sick children when there are so many more pleasant career options." Margaret stood frozen in her own doorway, still wearing scrubs that smelled faintly of antiseptic and the strawberry shampoo she'd used to wash dried blood from a child's hair after emergency surgery. She watched David nod along with the Astor's casual dismissal of her life's work, saw him glance at her uniform with what looked like embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, addressing the room. "I didn't realize you were having a meeting. I'll just go upstairs and change." "No need to apologize, dear," Mrs. Astor said with false warmth. "We were just leaving anyway. David, we'll talk more tomorrow about the portfolio adjustments." After they left, Margaret expected David to acknowledge the awkwardness of the situation, maybe even apologize for not defending her work. Instead, he said, "Margaret, in the future, could you maybe call before coming home early? It's just that clients like the Astors are used to a certain atmosphere. This is my home too, David. I live here." "Of course you do. I'm just saying that first impressions matter in my business, and sometimes your work clothes can be a little intense for people who aren't used to that environment." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a small, cold recognition that the man she'd married would never have asked her to hide who she was to make his clients comfortable. The second humiliation occurred 3 weeks later at David's country club. Margaret had been reluctant to attend the spring charity golf tournament, but David insisted her presence was important for relationship building with key clients. She wore a conservative pink dress and low heels, having learned from previous events that anything too stylish drew criticism for being flashy, while anything too simple earned comments about being underdressed. She spent most of the day sitting at a table with other wives, trying to contribute to conversations about vacation homes, private schools, and charity galas. The women weren't openly hostile, but their interactions with Margaret had the quality of adults being patient with a child who didn't quite understand the game being played. The breaking point came during lunch when Victoria Whitmore, the same woman whose cutting remarks Margaret had overheard at the firm's gala, began talking about her daughter's upcoming wedding. "We're flying the entire wedding party to Tuscany," Victoria announced. "My daughter simply fell in love with this 13th century villa. The ceremony will be in their private chapel, and the reception is in olive groves that have been in the same family for 6 generations." "How romantic," said another woman. "Will you be staying for long?" 2 weeks. We've rented the entire estate. 43 bedrooms, so there's plenty of space for extended family and close friends. The photographer is flying in from Milan, and we're having the flowers imported from the Netherlands." Margaret listened quietly, calculating in her head that Victoria was describing a wedding that likely cost more than Margaret's annual salary. When Victoria turned to her with false interest and asked, "Margaret, where did you and David honeymoon?" the table fell silent. "We went to Cape Cod," Margaret answered honestly. "We rented a small cottage for a week. It was lovely. We could walk to the beach and David taught me how to sail." The silence stretched uncomfortably before Victoria smiled with what she probably thought was kindness. "How authentic. There's something to be said for simple pleasures, isn't there?" The other women nodded with expressions that managed to be both pitying and patronizing. Margaret excused herself to use the restroom, but instead walked out to the parking lot and sat in David's car for 20 minutes, trying to understand why she felt so ashamed of what had been one of the happiest weeks of her life. When David found her later, she was staring out the windshield at golfers on the 18th green. "There you are. The Whitmores were looking for you. They wanted to discuss that pediatric wing donation they're considering." "I don't think I'm very good at this, David." "Good at what?" "This." She gestured toward the clubhouse. "Your world. I don't know how to talk about private jets and Italian villas. I don't have opinions about which charity galas are worth attending. I make decent money as a nurse, but not enough to contribute meaningfully to conversations about investment strategies or vacation property. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe you could try a little harder to find common ground. These people aren't bad. They're just different from what you're used to." "I am trying, David, but every conversation feels like a test I'm failing, and you—" She turned to look at him directly. "You used to be proud of what I do. You used to tell people I was saving lives, that my work mattered. Now you act like you wish I did something else." That's not true. But even as he said it, Margaret could see in his eyes that it wasn't entirely false either. 6 months earlier, Margaret had been working late on a particularly complex case involving 8-year-old Marcus Thompson, who needed experimental treatment for a rare genetic condition. The insurance company was fighting the coverage. The pharmaceutical company wanted additional clinical trial data, and Marcus's parents were understandably desperate for answers. Margaret had spent hours on the phone with medical researchers, insurance representatives, and patient advocates, finally securing approval for treatment that could save the boy's life. She came home exhausted but triumphant, ready to share the victory with David. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed for bed, scrolling through his phone with a glass of wine. "David, you won't believe what happened today. Remember I told you about Marcus Thompson, the little boy with the genetic condition? I got him approved for the experimental treatment. It took 6 months of fighting, but we did it. He's going to get the medicine he needs." David looked up from his phone with a vague smile. "That's great, honey. I'm proud of you." But his attention was already drifting back to his screen. Margaret could see he was reading emails, his mind completely absorbed by whatever business crisis required his attention. "David, this little boy might live because of the work we did today. His parents were crying when I called them. I mean, actually sobbing with relief." That's wonderful." He stood up, rinsing his wine glass in the sink. "I have an early meeting tomorrow with the Portland clients, so I'm heading up to bed." Margaret watched him leave the kitchen, feeling the deflation of having her greatest professional triumph treated as background noise to his business concerns. This was the moment she first truly understood that somewhere along the way, David had stopped seeing her work as important. Her victories weren't worth celebrating, her struggles weren't worth discussing, and her passion for healing sick children had become an inconvenience to be managed rather than a calling to be supported. That night, she lay awake next to her sleeping husband and realized she was married to a stranger. The third humiliation was the most deliberate, and it happened at Margaret's own workplace. David had never visited her at the hospital in the 4 years since his firm had moved to the downtown location. But on a Thursday afternoon in April, he appeared in the pediatric ward during her shift, wearing his most expensive suit and carrying flowers. "Surprise," he said, presenting her with 24 roses in front of the nurse's station. "I thought I'd take my beautiful wife to lunch." Margaret's colleagues were charmed. Dr. Peterson commented on how thoughtful David was, and the other nurses teased Margaret about how lucky she was to have such a romantic husband. But Margaret noticed things others missed. David's eyes constantly scanning the hallway, his posture suggesting he was performing rather than being spontaneous, the way he checked his phone every few minutes as if expecting an important call. During lunch at an upscale restaurant near the hospital, Margaret discovered the real reason for David's visit. "I've been thinking about something," he said after they'd ordered. "What would you say if I told you I might have an opportunity to expand the firm internationally? There's a chance to partner with a London investment group, but it would mean significant travel. Maybe eventually relocating." Margaret set down her fork. "London? David, my life is here. My job, my patients, my parents. I know it would be a big change, but think about the opportunities. You could do nursing anywhere, and London has excellent hospitals. You might even enjoy the challenge of working in a different healthcare system. You could do nursing anywhere." The phrase hit Margaret like cold water. 15 years of building relationships with patients, families, and colleagues, her reputation in the medical community, her specialization in pediatric oncology, all of it dismissed as transferable skills rather than a carefully built career. What if I don't want to leave Boston? What if I think my work here is important? David's expression shifted subtly, and for the first time, Margaret saw something that looked almost like contempt. "Margaret, you're a wonderful nurse, but let's be realistic. You take care of sick children. It's admirable, but it's not exactly irreplaceable work. There are thousands of nurses who could do your job." The words hung between them like poison in the air. Margaret felt her face flush, not with embarrassment but with anger. "Is that really what you think? That anyone could do what I do?" I think you're more talented than you realize, and I think you're limiting yourself by staying in such a narrow specialization. This could be a chance for both of us to grow." But Margaret understood now that David wasn't talking about growth. He was talking about escape. Escape from the wife who embarrassed him at client dinners, who worked in a profession he considered beneath his new social status, who represented the middle-class life he was determined to leave behind. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. The fourth micro-humiliation came in the form of a conversation Margaret wasn't supposed to overhear. She'd come home early from the hospital after a staff meeting was canceled, planning to surprise David with homemade dinner before he returned from work. As she approached their front door, she could hear voices from the backyard. David was on a business call, pacing on their deck while talking on his phone. "Look, James, I understand the optics, but I'm thinking long-term here. Margaret she's a good person, but she doesn't fit the trajectory I'm on. The clients we're trying to attract, the social circles we need to move in, she's becoming a liability rather than an asset." Margaret froze with her key in the lock. "I know how that sounds," David continued. "But consider this. Victoria Whitmore pulls her husband's account if she doesn't like the dinner party conversation. The Astors have been dropping hints about how important it is that their financial advisor understands their lifestyle. These people have options, James. They can take their money anywhere. If I want to compete at this level, every aspect of my life has to reflect success." Margaret could hear James's response as a murmur through the phone, but David's reply was crystal clear. "Exactly. So the question becomes, do I prioritize a marriage that worked when I was making $60,000 a year? Or do I make the changes necessary to secure a client base that could make us both very wealthy? It's not personal, James. It's just business." Margaret backed away from the door and sat in her car for an hour, processing the fact that her husband was discussing their 15-year marriage as if it were an underperforming stock in his portfolio. When David came home later and found her cooking dinner as if nothing had happened, she managed to smile and ask about his day while feeling like she was observing herself from outside her own body. That night, she began what she would later think of as her documentation phase, carefully noting David's schedule, his phone habits, his unexplained absences, and his increasingly frequent business dinners that stretched until nearly midnight. The fifth and most devastating humiliation occurred at Margaret's own birthday party. She had mentioned casually that she was turning 43, and David had surprised her by suggesting they host a dinner party for a few friends. Margaret was touched by the gesture until she realized David had invited 6 couples, all from his business circle, none of Margaret's colleagues from the hospital. The evening started awkwardly when Victoria Whitmore arrived with a gift that was clearly expensive but completely impersonal, a silk scarf in colors that didn't suit Margaret and a style she would never wear. The other guests followed suit with gifts that seemed chosen to send a message. A membership to an exclusive spa Margaret would never feel comfortable using, a coffee table book about European art that would look out of place in their home, jewelry that was too formal for Margaret's lifestyle. But the real humiliation came during dinner when the conversation turned to summer vacation plans. Each couple described elaborate trips, safaris in Kenya, private yacht charters in the Mediterranean, cultural tours of Asia with personal guides. When the attention inevitably turned to Margaret and David, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. "We're still deciding," David said smoothly. "I've been looking at some interesting possibilities." "Oh, you simply must come with us to the Hamptons," Victoria insisted. "We've rented the most divine house for the entire month of July. There's plenty of room, and the social calendar is absolutely packed with events." Margaret saw David's eyes light up with interest, but she also saw something else: calculation. He was weighing the professional advantages of a month in the Hamptons against the social risk of bringing Margaret into that environment. "That's incredibly generous," Margaret said carefully, "but I can't take a month off work. July is actually one of our busiest times at the hospital." The table fell silent in a way that felt different from the usual awkward pauses. This time, Margaret sensed she had committed a social error that went beyond simple awkwardness. "Surely you could arrange something," Mrs. Astor said with forced lightness. "I mean, it's not as if the hospital couldn't function without you for a few weeks." "Well, actually," Margaret began, but David cut her off. "Margaret tends to be overly conscientious about work," he said with a laugh that sounded apologetic. "I keep telling her the hospital survived before she got there and will survive if she takes a proper vacation." The guests laughed along, but Margaret heard the subtext clearly. David was embarrassed by her dedication to her job and was signaling to his friends that he understood her priorities were misplaced. After the guests left, Margaret stood in her kitchen surrounded by gifts she didn't want and the remains of a party that had felt more like a performance review than a celebration. "That went well, don't you think?" David said, loading glasses into the dishwasher. "Did it? Everyone seemed to have a good time. Victoria mentioned that dinner next week. I think she's warming up to you." Margaret looked at her husband, really looked at him, and realized that he genuinely believed the evening had been successful. In his mind, Margaret had played her role adequately. The guests had been impressed with their home and hospitality, and he had strengthened important business relationships. The fact that his wife had felt like an outsider at her own birthday party wasn't even on his radar. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy? In this marriage, I mean. With me?" The question seemed to surprise him. What kind of question is that? "Of course I'm happy. We have a good life, Margaret. A beautiful home, financial security, respect in the community." "That's not what I asked." David paused, his hands still holding a wine glass. "Margaret, happiness it's more complicated when you're adults with real responsibilities. We're not 25 anymore. We can't just focus on feelings and romantic gestures. We have to think about building something lasting." It wasn't an answer to her question, and they both knew it. The conversation that would later seem like the turning point had happened 2 months before Margaret's birthday, during one of David's increasingly rare evenings at home. They were watching television, a British mystery series Margaret enjoyed, when David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, smiled slightly, and began typing a response. "Work?" Margaret asked during a commercial break. "Oh, yes. A client has some questions about portfolio rebalancing." But Margaret had caught a glimpse of the message preview on his screen. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Wear that blue tie I like so much." It was signed with a heart emoji and the initial E. Margaret felt her world tilt slightly. In 15 years of marriage, David had never received flirtatious text messages from clients. His female clients were all older, married women who conducted business through their husbands or trusted financial advisors. They certainly didn't text him about clothing preferences at 9:30 on a Wednesday night. She managed to keep her expression neutral, but her mind began working with the analytical precision that made her such a good nurse. David's behavior over the past year suddenly took on new significance. The unexplained late nights, the increased attention to his appearance, the way he guarded his phone more carefully, the growing emotional distance between them. "David, are we okay? I mean, really okay?" He looked up from his phone with surprise. "What do you mean? I feel like we barely talk anymore. You're working all the time, and when you're home, you seem distracted. I miss you." For a moment, David's expression softened into something that looked like the man she'd married. "I'm sorry, Margaret. The business is at a critical growth phase. I know I've been preoccupied, but it's important for our future." Our future or your future? The question hung in the air between them. David set down his phone and turned to face her fully. "What's that supposed to mean? Sometimes I feel like you're building a life that doesn't include me. At least not the me that exists now." "Margaret, you're being dramatic. Of course you're part of my future. We're married. We're a team." But even as he said the words, Margaret could see something in his eyes that looked like guilt, or maybe pity. She realized with crystalline clarity that David saw her as an obligation rather than a partner, a reminder of his past rather than a companion for his future. That night, after David fell asleep, Margaret went downstairs and did something she'd never done before. She looked through his phone. What she found would change everything. The phone contained 6 months of text messages with someone named Elena Rodriguez. The early messages were business-related. Elena was apparently considering a significant investment with David's firm. But as Margaret scrolled through the conversation history, she watched their relationship evolve from professional to personal to intimate. Elena was sophisticated, cultured, and wealthy. She traveled frequently for her import-export business, owned property in 3 cities, and had what seemed like unlimited resources for expensive dinners, weekend trips, and luxury experiences. She was also beautiful. Her photo showed a woman in her late 30s with striking features and an elegant style that belonged naturally in the world David was trying to enter. But it was Elena's messages that revealed David's true feelings about his marriage. In response to her question about why he seemed distracted during their dinner in New York, David had written, I've been thinking about what you said about not letting the past hold back the future. Margaret she's a good person, but she represents a version of myself that I've outgrown. I married her when I was a different person with different goals. She deserves someone who appreciates the life she wants, but that's not who I am anymore. Elena's response was perfectly crafted. You're not responsible for staying in a relationship that no longer serves either of you. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let someone find happiness with a person who can truly appreciate them. Margaret read months of conversations in which David detailed his frustrations with their marriage, his embarrassment about Margaret's career and social awkwardness, his resentment about feeling trapped in a middle-class lifestyle when he was capable of so much more. Elena responded to each complaint with understanding, validation, and subtle encouragement for David to prioritize his authentic self. The messages also revealed that Elena was far more than a potential client. She was David's mistress, and they had been conducting an affair for 8 months. They met regularly when Elena was in Boston for business, took weekend trips together when David claimed to be at investment conferences, and were planning a future together that explicitly excluded Margaret. In one particularly devastating exchange, Elena had asked David what he planned to do about his marriage. His response was, "I'm working up the courage to ask Margaret for a divorce. She'll be hurt initially, but I think part of her knows we've grown apart. She's a practical woman. She'll understand that we want different things now. And honestly, Elena, I think she'll be happier with someone who shares her values. I'm not that person anymore, and pretending to be is making us both miserable." Margaret sat in her darkened living room, reading by the light of David's phone screen, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of reality. For months, she had been questioning herself, wondering if she was too sensitive, too inflexible, too ordinary for David's new life. But now she understood that David had been systematically preparing to leave her while maintaining the fiction that their marriage was simply going through a rough patch. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the gaslighting, the months of making her feel inadequate while he planned his exit strategy with another woman. As Margaret scrolled through the most recent messages, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Elena and David weren't just planning a future together, they were planning to do it with Margaret's money. The house, the investment accounts, even Margaret's retirement savings were all jointly held assets that David was preparing to claim in the divorce. According to his messages to Elena, he had already consulted with a divorce attorney who specialized in protecting successful individuals from vindictive spouses in high-asset divorces. Margaret realized with horrifying clarity that she was being set up. David's increasingly critical behavior, his public embarrassment of her, his constant suggestions that she was holding him back, all of it was designed to build a case that she was an unreasonable wife who couldn't adapt to her husband's success. When he filed for divorce, he would portray himself as the long-suffering husband who had tried to save the marriage while she refused to change. But Margaret also noticed something else in Elena's messages, small inconsistencies that her trained eye for detail couldn't ignore. Elena claimed to travel frequently, but her stories about different cities contained factual errors. She described expensive restaurants and luxury hotels with enthusiasm, but occasionally got basic details wrong. Her import-export business was vaguely defined, and she never mentioned specific products, clients, or industry challenges the way real business owners did. Margaret's nursing background had taught her to spot when patients weren't telling the complete truth about their symptoms or medical history. People who were lying often provided too much irrelevant detail while being vague about crucial facts. Elena's messages had that same quality, elaborate stories about exotic locations and expensive experiences, but no concrete details about the business that allegedly funded her lifestyle. As dawn approached and David stirred upstairs, Margaret deleted the message history from the phone's recent activity log and returned it to his bedside table. But she had memorized every important detail, and she was beginning to formulate a plan that would protect her from David's betrayal while exposing him to consequences he never saw coming. The next morning, Margaret called in sick for the first time in 2 years and drove to her parents' restaurant in Chinatown. She found her mother, Lynn, in the kitchen preparing vegetables for the lunch rush, and her father, Wei, reviewing invoices at his small desk near the stove. At 78 and 75 respectively, they still worked 6 days a week, maintaining the restaurant that had supported their family for 30 years. "Mei, what brings you here so early?" her mother asked, immediately sensing something was wrong. "You look tired." Margaret sat at the small table where she'd done homework as a child and told her parents everything: David's affair, the planned divorce, the financial betrayal he was orchestrating. She expected them to be shocked, angry, or hurt on her behalf. Instead, her father nodded with what looked like sad resignation. "We wondered when you would see it," he said quietly. "David has not been himself for some time. When he visits, he looks at our restaurant like it embarrasses him. He no longer asks about your work with the children. Last Christmas, he talked only about his clients and their money, as if nothing else in the world had value. You knew something was wrong?" Her mother wiped her hands on her apron and sat beside Margaret. "We knew David was changing, but we hoped it was temporary. Success can confuse people about what truly matters. We thought perhaps he would remember who he was before the money became so important. But now," Wei asked gently, "what will you do now?" Margaret had been asking herself the same question. She could file for divorce first, trying to protect her assets and expose David's affair. She could confront David directly, demanding honesty about Elena and his plans to leave. She could simply wait for him to file for divorce and try to defend herself against whatever lies he told about their marriage. But as she sat in the restaurant that had taught her the value of hard work and integrity, Margaret realized she wanted something more than just protection or revenge. She wanted justice. David wasn't just betraying her. He was actively trying to destroy her financial security and reputation to fund his new life with a woman he barely knew. If Elena was a con artist, as Margaret suspected, David was being set up for his own fall. But his willingness to sacrifice Margaret's well-being in pursuit of status and sexual gratification deserved consequences that went beyond a messy divorce. "I'm going to fight," Margaret told her parents, "but not the way David expects." Her father smiled for the first time that morning. "Good. Your grandmother always said that patience and planning are more powerful than anger and haste. What do you need from us?" Margaret spent the next hour outlining her suspicions about Elena and her plan to investigate the woman's true identity. She would need her parents' help to conduct surveillance without David becoming suspicious, and she would need their restaurant as a base of operations for the careful detective work that would expose Elena's criminal background. As she drove home that afternoon, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement. For too long, she had been reacting to David's increasingly cruel behavior, questioning herself and trying to become someone who would fit into his new world. Now she was going to take control of her own story and ensure that David's betrayal resulted in consequences worthy of his actions. Margaret's investigation began with Mrs. Rose Delacroix, the elderly former private investigator who lived next door. At 83, Mrs. Delacroix had supposedly retired from active detective work, but she maintained contacts throughout law enforcement and had an insatiable curiosity about human nature. More importantly, she had noticed David's changed behavior and Elena's occasional visits to the house when Margaret was at work. "I've been wondering when you'd figure it out, dear," Mrs. Delacroix said, when Margaret approached her with carefully phrased questions about investigating someone's background. "I've seen that woman coming and going when you're at the hospital. Very expensive clothes, very careful timing. Professional mistress written all over her." "Professional mistress?" "Oh, yes. Some women make a career of targeting successful, insecure men. They study their marks, create personas designed to appeal to specific psychological weaknesses, then systematically extract money and resources before disappearing. Your husband fits the profile perfectly. Recent success, desperate for validation, married to a woman he perceives as beneath his new status." Delacroix explained that women like Elena typically had extensive criminal backgrounds that included identity theft, credit card fraud, and investment scams. They moved frequently, used multiple names, and specialized in targeting men going through midlife transitions who were vulnerable to flattery and sexual attention. "The question is," Mrs. Delacroix continued, "do you want to save your husband from being victimized, or do you want to ensure he faces consequences for victimizing you?" Margaret considered the question seriously. 6 months earlier, she might have tried to warn David about Elena's true nature, hoping to save their marriage by revealing the affair as a manipulation rather than genuine love. But David's systematic cruelty, his planned financial betrayal, and his willingness to destroy her reputation to justify his actions had changed her perspective fundamentally. "I want justice," Margaret said finally, "for both of us." Mrs. Delacroix smiled with genuine warmth. "Then let's find out who Elena Rodriguez really is, shall we?" Over the next 2 weeks, Mrs. Delacroix used her law enforcement contacts to run background checks on Elena Rodriguez and several similar names. What they discovered exceeded Margaret's suspicions. Elena Rodriguez was actually Isabella Marquez, a sophisticated con artist wanted by the FBI for defrauding wealthy men out of more than $3 million over 5 years. She had used at least 8 different identities, operated in 12 major cities, and specialized in targeting investment advisors and financial planners who managed high-net-worth clients. Isabella's method was always the same: extensive research on her target through social media, professional networks, and public records. She would create a persona designed to appeal to their specific insecurities and desires, then initiate contact through business channels to establish legitimacy. The relationship would develop over months, with Isabella gradually encouraging her marks to make increasingly risky financial decisions that ultimately benefited her rather than them. Her victims included a Miami real estate developer who lost his retirement savings in a fake international investment scheme, a Chicago wealth manager who embezzled client funds to support Isabella's fictional import business, and a Seattle tech entrepreneur who signed over his company stock to fund what he believed was their joint venture in European art acquisition. But Isabella had made one crucial mistake with David. She had chosen a target whose wife was intelligent, suspicious, and had access to investigative resources. Margaret now knew not only Elena Isabella's real identity, but also her current location, her planned timeline for fleeing the country, and the specific scam she was running on David. According to Mrs. Delacroix's FBI contact, Isabella was in the final phase of her con. She had convinced David to move significant amounts of money into investment accounts that she controlled, telling him they were preparing to fund their new life together in London. What David didn't know was that Isabella planned to drain those accounts and disappear within 2 weeks, leaving him both financially devastated and facing potential criminal charges for the questionable transactions she had encouraged. "So," Mrs. Delacroix said as they reviewed the FBI file on Isabella Marquez, "your husband is about to lose everything to a con artist, and he's planning to divorce you to fund his own destruction. What kind of justice are you interested in?" Margaret studied the photographs of Isabella's previous victims, successful men who had lost not just money, but their businesses, their reputations, and in some cases, their freedom. She thought about David's messages describing her as a liability, his public humiliation of her career and values, his systematic preparation to steal her assets and destroy her reputation. "I want him to face the consequences of his choices," Margaret said carefully. "But I also want to make sure Isabella faces consequences for her crimes. And if those two goals happen to coincide in a particularly poetic way," Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks, "I think that would be perfect." Armed with knowledge of Isabella's true identity and David's planned betrayal, Margaret began phase 2 of her plan, gathering evidence and positioning herself to control the timing of the revelation. She knew she had only a narrow window before Isabella disappeared with David's money, and she needed to ensure that when the truth came out, it would happen in the most public and devastating way possible. Margaret's first step was documenting everything. Using a small camera borrowed from Mrs. Delacroix, she photographed David's phone messages whenever possible. She made copies of financial documents that showed the suspicious money transfers to accounts Isabella controlled. She compiled a timeline of David's affair and Isabella's con game that clearly demonstrated how the financial fraud had been orchestrated. More importantly, Margaret began changing her own financial position to protect herself from David's planned betrayal. Working with her parents' longtime attorney, she quietly moved her personal savings to accounts that David couldn't access. She documented their jointly held assets and made sure she had independent proof of her contributions to their home and investment accounts. If David wanted a financial war, she would be prepared. But Margaret's most crucial preparation involved understanding David's business schedule and social calendar. Through careful observation and strategic questions, she learned that David was planning to propose to Isabella at a specific event, the spring charity gala where many of his most important clients would be present. According to his text messages, David had already retained a divorce attorney and was preparing to serve Margaret with papers immediately after the gala, allowing him to marry Isabella within days of the divorce being finalized. The timeline was perfect for Margaret's purposes. The charity gala would provide maximum public exposure for David's humiliation, and the presence of his clients would ensure that the consequences of his actions extended beyond personal embarrassment to professional destruction. Isabella's arrest at such a public event would create exactly the kind of scandal that David's status-conscious clients would find unforgivable. Margaret spent her lunch breaks at the hospital researching Isabella's criminal methods and coordinating with Mrs. Delacroix's FBI contact to ensure that federal agents would be ready to make the arrest at the optimal moment. She learned that Isabella was wanted on outstanding warrants in 3 states and that her capture was a high priority for federal law enforcement. The psychological preparation was as important as the logistical planning. Margaret had to maintain her normal routine with David while knowing that he was actively working to destroy her life. She had to smile and make conversation with a man who was systematically stealing from her while planning to publicly humiliate her as an inadequate wife. She had to resist the urge to confront him with the evidence she'd gathered, knowing that premature revelation would allow both David and Isabella to escape the full consequences of their actions. The emotional toll of this deception was enormous. Margaret found herself lying awake at night, rehearsing conversations and imagining different scenarios for how the confrontation would unfold. She had always prided herself on her honesty and directness, but now she was engaged in an elaborate deception that required her to act like everything was normal while orchestrating her husband's downfall. Her colleague, Dr. Peterson, noticed the strain and gently asked if everything was all right at home. Margaret deflected the questions with vague references to work stress, but she could see the concern in her friend's eyes. At her parents' restaurant, Wei and Lin offered quiet support without asking for details, trusting that their daughter knew what she was doing. Mrs. Delacroix became Margaret's primary confidant and strategic advisor. The elderly woman had seen enough human duplicity during her investigative career to understand the psychology of both cons and revenge. She helped Margaret think through the potential consequences of different approaches and insisted on backup plans for every aspect of the operation. Revenge is a dish best served at room temperature, Mrs. Delacroix advised one afternoon as they reviewed FBI reports on Isabella's activities. Not cold. That suggests you've lost your passion. Not hot. That means you're acting from emotion rather than strategy. Room temperature means you're thinking clearly, but still committed to seeing justice done. Margaret found that advice particularly helpful during the most difficult moments of her deception. When David came home from another business dinner with Isabella and kissed her goodnight with lips that tasted like another woman's perfume, Margaret reminded herself that she was serving justice at exactly the right temperature. The most challenging aspect of Margaret's preparations was the growing realization that she was fundamentally changing who she was. The woman who had married David 15 years earlier would never have been capable of such elaborate deception and manipulation. That Margaret would have confronted her husband directly, demanded honesty, and tried to work through their problems with counseling and compromise. But David's systematic cruelty had burned away Margaret's naive trust in his fundamental decency. His willingness to steal from her to fund his affair with a criminal demonstrated that he was no longer the man she had married. If he was capable of such calculated betrayal, then she was capable of calculated justice. The moment that crystallized Margaret's resolve came 3 weeks before the charity gala. She arrived home from a particularly difficult day at the hospital. They had lost a patient, a 6-year-old girl named Amy, whose leukemia had proven resistant to all treatments. Margaret had been Amy's primary nurse for 8 months, and the child's death had affected her deeply. She found David in his home office talking on the phone with someone about vacation plans. His voice was animated with excitement as he described a resort in the Caribbean where he and we were planning to spend 2 weeks in June. Margaret realized he was making post-divorce honeymoon plans with Isabella while his wife stood in their doorway, still wearing scrubs stained with the tears of grieving parents. When David noticed her, his expression shifted to irritation rather than concern. He ended his call quickly and turned to face her with obvious impatience. "You're home early," he said, not bothering to ask why she looked upset. "We lost Amy today, the little girl with leukemia. She was 6. David's expression softened slightly, but his response revealed how completely he had disconnected from Margaret's emotional world. "I'm sorry to hear that. That must be difficult for you." The words were appropriate, but his tone was that of someone offering condolences to an acquaintance rather than comfort to a grieving spouse. There was no offer to hold her, no suggestion that they talk about her loss, no recognition that the death of a child she had cared for represented a genuine trauma that deserved support. Instead, David glanced at his watch and said, "I have a dinner meeting tonight with potential clients. Will you be okay on your own?" Margaret looked at her husband, the man who had once held her while she cried over difficult cases, who had understood that her patients' deaths were losses she carried personally, and saw a stranger who was annoyed by her grief because it interfered with his social schedule. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. After David left for his dinner meeting, actually a romantic evening with Isabella, as Margaret's investigation had revealed, she sat alone in their living room and made peace with what she was planning to do. The man she had married was gone, replaced by someone capable of casual cruelty and systematic betrayal. If David was willing to destroy her life for money and status, then he deserved to face the full consequences of his choices. That night, Margaret called Mrs. Delacroix and said simply, "I'm ready." The final week before the charity gala was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Margaret had to maintain the pretense of normalcy, while David made increasingly obvious preparations for his new life. He bought expensive new clothes, made mysterious phone calls about timing and coordination, and began staying out until very late without offering explanations. Margaret noticed that David had also started treating her with a kind of distant kindness that felt more insulting than his previous coldness. He brought her flowers, complimented her appearance, and made small gestures of affection that would look good to observers but felt hollow and manipulative. She realized he was creating evidence of being a considerate husband so that his divorce attorney could argue he had tried to save the marriage. The most surreal moment came when David suggested they attend couples counseling. "I think we've been growing apart," he said over breakfast, his tone suggesting this was a recent insight rather than the result of months of deliberate emotional sabotage. Maybe it would help to talk to someone about how to reconnect. Margaret stared at him across their kitchen table, marveling at his ability to suggest therapy while actively planning to divorce her and steal her money. "Do you think counseling could help us?" "I think it's worth trying. Marriage is work, Margaret. Just because we're going through a rough patch doesn't mean we should give up on 15 years together." The performance was so convincing that Margaret almost admired its audacity. David was positioning himself as the husband who had tried everything to save the marriage, including therapy, before reluctantly concluding that they were incompatible. When he filed for divorce, he would be able to claim he had made every effort to reconcile. "That's a thoughtful idea," Margaret said carefully. "Should I make the appointment?" "Actually, I already spoke to someone. Dr. Marina Castellanos. She comes highly recommended for couples dealing with lifestyle transitions." Margaret nodded, wondering if Dr. Castellanos knew she was being used as a prop in David's elaborate deception. She made a mental note to call the therapist after David's world collapsed and explain how her services had been weaponized. During this period, Margaret also received several visits from Isabella, who had begun appearing at their house when David was at work. The visits were ostensibly social. Isabella would claim to be in the neighborhood and drop by to chat, but Margaret recognized them as reconnaissance missions. Isabella was studying the house, assessing the value of their possessions, and probably looking for financial documents or other information that would be useful in the final phase of her con. These conversations were perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of Margaret's deception. Isabella was charming, sophisticated, and genuinely interested in Margaret's work at the hospital. She asked intelligent questions about pediatric nursing, expressed admiration for Margaret's dedication to sick children, and seemed to understand the emotional demands of the profession in ways that David no longer did. If Margaret hadn't known Isabella's true identity, she might have genuinely liked the woman. Isabella possessed all the qualities that David claimed to value: cultural sophistication, professional success, social grace, but she deployed those qualities in service of criminal manipulation. She was everything Margaret was not, which was precisely why David found her irresistible and why she was so effective at exploiting his psychological vulnerabilities. During one particularly twisted conversation, Isabella had actually offered Margaret advice about her marriage. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," Isabella said over coffee in Margaret's kitchen, "but David seems like he's under a lot of pressure lately. Success can be hard on relationships, especially when one partner is changing faster than the other." Margaret almost choked on her coffee. "What do you mean?" "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing serious. It's just that successful men sometimes go through phases where they question everything. Their careers, their relationships, their life choices. David mentioned that you two have been growing apart lately." The casual revelation that David was discussing their marriage with his mistress was breathtaking in its audacity. Isabella was not only sleeping with Margaret's husband, but was comfortable enough in the relationship to offer Margaret relationship counseling based on David's complaints about their marriage. "He talks to you about our relationship?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about how Isabella would explain her intimate knowledge of their marriage. "Not in detail, of course, Just general concerns about communication and compatibility. You know how men are. They sometimes need to talk through their feelings with someone who can offer an objective perspective. Margaret marveled at the con artist's ability to reframe adultery as therapy. Isabella had positioned herself not as the other woman, but as a neutral advisor helping David navigate marital difficulties. It was a brilliant psychological manipulation that allowed David to feel virtuous about his affair while giving Isabella access to detailed information about their relationship. But then something incredible happened that would change everything. The night before the charity gala, Margaret received a phone call that elevated her carefully planned revenge into something far more significant. Mrs. Delacroix's FBI contact, Agent Sarah Martinez, called to inform Margaret that Isabella Marquez had just been connected to a much larger criminal enterprise than they had initially realized. "We've been tracking a sophisticated investment fraud ring that's been operating internationally," Agent Martinez explained. "Isabella Marquez isn't just a lone con artist. She's part of an organized network that specializes in targeting financial professionals to gain access to their clients' accounts. Your husband may be more than just a victim. He might be an unwitting accomplice in a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation." The FBI had discovered that Isabella's import-export business was actually a front for moving stolen money between countries. The investment accounts she had convinced David to establish weren't just for their personal use. They were vehicles for laundering funds stolen from her previous victims and other criminal enterprises. David's legitimate business was being used to clean dirty money, and his professional reputation was providing cover for international financial crimes. "The good news," Agent Martinez continued, "is that if your husband is truly a victim rather than a willing participant, we can structure the arrest to protect him from prosecution, but we'll need your help to make sure the timing works correctly." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her carefully laid plans. She had been preparing for David's public humiliation and financial consequences, but she hadn't anticipated that his affair might result in criminal charges that could destroy his life completely. Despite his betrayal, Margaret found herself reluctant to see David face federal prosecution for crimes he didn't understand he was committing. "What kind of help do you need?" "We need Isabella to make one more significant financial transaction before we arrest her. Our goal is to catch her in the act of money laundering, while we can also arrest her accomplices in other cities. The charity gala provides perfect timing. She'll be in a public place where she can't escape, and the financial transaction she's planning for that evening will give us everything we need for prosecution." Agent Martinez explained that Isabella was planning to transfer nearly $2 million out of the account she controlled during the gala itself. She had convinced David that they needed to move their money to European banks immediately after he filed for divorce, claiming it would protect their assets from Margaret's attempts to claim them in the settlement. What David didn't know was that the money being transferred included funds stolen from Isabella's previous victims and criminal proceeds from other cases. His legitimate investment accounts were being used to clean money from drug trafficking, human smuggling, and corporate fraud. When the FBI traced those transactions, David would appear to be a willing participant in international money laundering unless the arrest was handled very carefully. "So," Agent Martinez said, "the question is whether you want to save your husband from federal prosecution or let him face the full consequences of his actions." Margaret stared out her kitchen window at the garden she had planted when they first moved into the house, rows of vegetables and flowers that she had nurtured through seasons of growth and decay. David had always mocked her gardening as a waste of time, but Margaret understood that some things required patience, care, and faith in eventual harvest. "I want justice," she said finally, "but I don't want him destroyed for crimes he's too stupid to understand he's committing." Little did he know, she had a plan that would give him exactly what he deserved. Margaret spent the morning of the charity gala making final preparations for the most complex day of her life. She had to coordinate with the FBI, manage her own emotional responses, and ensure that David remained unaware of the trap being set for both him and Isabella. More importantly, she had to prepare herself psychologically for the end of her marriage and the beginning of whatever came next. Her first call was to Dr. Peterson at the hospital. Margaret had never taken a personal day for anything less than genuine illness, but she needed this Saturday free to see her revenge through to completion. "Are you all right?" Dr. Peterson asked with immediate concern. "You haven't seemed like yourself lately." "I'm fine, Sarah. Just dealing with some personal issues that should be resolved after tonight." "Margaret, if you need someone to talk to..." "I know. Thank you. I might take you up on that offer next week." After she hung up, Margaret realized that Dr. Peterson's friendship represented something she would need in the coming weeks. Relationships that were based on who she actually was, rather than who she appeared to be in David's social circle. She made a mental note to nurture those connections as she rebuilt her life. Margaret's second call was to her parents, asking them to keep the restaurant open late in case she needed a place to go after the evening's events. Wei and Lin asked no questions, simply confirming that they would be available if she needed them. Their unconditional support reminded Margaret that she had a foundation of love and respect that existed independent of her marriage to David. The third and most important call was to Agent Martinez, confirming the final details of Isabella's arrest. The FBI had positioned agents throughout the hotel where the charity gala was being held, and they had coordinated with local police to ensure that the arrest would be conducted with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to bystanders. "Remember," Agent Martinez said, "we need Isabella to initiate the financial transfer before we move in. According to our intelligence, she's planning to use her phone to authorize the transactions during the dinner portion of the event. Once those transfers begin, we'll have everything we need for federal charges. And David? If he cooperates fully and provides evidence about how Isabella manipulated him, he'll likely face civil penalties rather than criminal charges. His business will be damaged, and he'll have to pay significant fines, but he won't go to prison." Margaret found that outcome satisfactory. David would face serious consequences for his betrayal and his willingness to be manipulated by a criminal, but he wouldn't be destroyed for crimes he committed through stupidity rather than malice. Her final preparation was the most personal, deciding what to wear to witness the end of her marriage. Margaret chose a dress she had owned for years but rarely worn because David had once commented that it made her look too professional for social events. It was elegant, understated, and made her feel confident rather than decorative. She styled her hair simply, wore jewelry that had been gifts from her parents, and looked in the mirror at a woman who was about to reclaim her own life. At 3 o'clock, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. James Morrison, David's business partner, arrived at her door with an expression of serious concern. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I need to talk to you about David." "Of course. Come in." James sat in their living room and looked around at the photographs and mementos that documented 15 years of marriage. "I think David is making a serious mistake," he said without preamble. "I've been watching him make increasingly poor decisions, both personally and professionally. I'm worried he's going to destroy everything he's worked for." Margaret realized that James knew about the affair, or at least suspected it. "What kind of mistake?" "Margaret, I've known you both for a long time. You're one of the most decent people I've ever met, and David used to know how lucky he was to be married to you. Something has happened to his judgment, and I think it's going to cost him more than he realizes. Have you tried talking to him?" James nodded grimly. "I've tried, but success has changed him, and not for the better. He's making decisions based on what he thinks will impress people rather than what's actually in his best interests. And the people he's trying to impress," James shook his head. "Let's just say I don't think they have his best interests at heart." Margaret saw an opportunity to plant seeds for David's post-arrest cooperation. "James, if David gets into serious trouble, legal trouble, would you be willing to help him?" "Legal trouble? Margaret, what do you know that I don't? I know that David has been making some very poor choices, and I think the consequences are going to catch up with him soon. When they do, he's going to need friends who remember who he used to be." James studied Margaret's face carefully. "You know about the affair, don't you?" "I know about a lot of things." "And you're not going to warn him?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "James, if someone you cared about was walking toward a cliff, would you warn them, or would you try to understand why they were choosing to walk in that direction?" "I'd warn them, obviously. Even if they had been pushing you toward the same cliff for months? Even if warning them meant they could push you over the edge instead?" James was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose that would depend on whether I thought they deserved to fall. David has made his choices. Tonight, he'll face the consequences of those choices. If he's smart and if he has friends like you who are willing to help him rebuild afterward, he might survive this. But he's going to fall, James. The only question is how far." After James left, Margaret felt a surprising sense of closure. She had done everything she could to prepare for David's destruction, while also ensuring he would have support for rebuilding afterward. Her revenge was complete, but it wasn't vindictive. It was proportionate to his betrayal, and designed to teach him the cost of his actions without destroying him permanently. At 6 o'clock, David emerged from their bedroom dressed in his most expensive tuxedo, looking more handsome and confident than Margaret had seen him in months. He was clearly excited about the evening ahead, the culmination of his affair, the beginning of his new life, and the public debut of his relationship with Isabella. "You look beautiful," he said, and for a moment, Margaret glimpsed the man she had married. "I know things have been difficult between us lately, but I want you to know that I appreciate you coming tonight. These events are important for the business." Margaret almost felt sorry for him. David genuinely believed that his wife was dutifully accompanying him to a business function while he prepared to publicly propose to his mistress. He had no idea that Margaret knew about Isabella, the planned divorce, or the criminal enterprise he had unknowingly joined. He was about to experience the most devastating evening of his life, and he was looking forward to it. "Of course," Margaret said simply. "I wouldn't miss it." They drove to the hotel in comfortable silence, David texting frequently with someone Margaret knew was Isabella, coordinating their evening plans. Margaret watched the familiar streets of Boston pass by and realized she was saying goodbye to her life as Mrs. David Kellerman. Tomorrow she would begin rebuilding herself as simply Margaret Chen, and she found herself looking forward to that process. The charity gala was held in the ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, and Margaret immediately spotted FBI agents positioned throughout the room. Agent Martinez had briefed her on the agents' locations, but their professional demeanor and strategic positioning would have been obvious to anyone trained to notice such details. Isabella, however, was too focused on her final con to pay attention to law enforcement presence. Margaret watched Isabella work the room with professional grace, charming David's clients while positioning herself for maximum advantage. She wore a stunning red dress that made her the center of attention, and she moved through conversations with the confidence of someone who belonged in this world. If Margaret hadn't known Isabella's true identity, she would have been genuinely impressed by the woman's social skills. David was clearly proud to be seen with Isabella, introducing her to important clients as his special friend and hinting at exciting developments in their relationship. Margaret could see him calculating the professional advantages of being associated with such a sophisticated, attractive woman. Isabella had successfully convinced him that she was an asset to his career rather than a threat to his freedom. The evening's entertainment included a silent auction, cocktail reception, and formal dinner, followed by dancing and what the program described as special announcements from our generous supporters. Margaret knew that David was planning to propose during the special announcements segment, making their engagement part of the evening's charitable celebration. But Margaret also knew that Isabella was planning to initiate her final financial transfers during dinner, using the cover of normal social conversation to conduct international money laundering through her phone. The FBI was waiting for those transfers to begin before making their arrest, which meant Isabella would be taken into custody just moments before David planned to propose. As they moved through the cocktail reception, Margaret found herself oddly detached from the social dynamics that had once caused her such anxiety. Conversations with Victoria Whitmore and the other wives felt surreal. These women were discussing their usual topics of travel and social events while Margaret waited for their world to explode with scandal. "Margaret, you look lovely tonight," Victoria said with what passed for warmth in their social circle. "That dress is quite flattering." "Thank you. I hope you'll join us for lunch next week. We're planning the summer charity tour and we could use someone with your practical perspective." Margaret realized that Victoria's invitation was probably genuine. These women had never actively disliked her. They simply hadn't understood how to relate to someone outside their social class. After tonight's revelations about David's affair and criminal connections, they would probably feel genuine sympathy for Margaret as the wronged wife who had been publicly humiliated by her husband's poor judgment. "I'd like that," Margaret said, surprised to realize she meant it. "I think next week might be a good time for new beginnings." What do you think will happen when the FBI makes their move? Share your predictions in the comments. During dinner, Margaret watched Isabella carefully while maintaining normal conversation with the people at their table. David had arranged for them to sit with his most important clients, the Whitmores, the Astors, and two other wealthy couples who represented significant revenue for his firm. Isabella was performing brilliantly, telling charming stories about her travel experiences and asking intelligent questions about the other guests' business interests. But Margaret noticed the moment when Isabella's performance shifted slightly. During the main course, Isabella became more animated in her conversation while simultaneously texting on her phone with practiced discretion. To most observers, she appeared to be responding to business messages while enjoying dinner conversation. Margaret knew she was actually authorizing financial transfers that constituted federal crimes. Agent Martinez had positioned herself at a table across the room where she could observe Isabella's phone activity. When Isabella initiated the first transfer, Agent Martinez would signal other agents positioned throughout the ballroom. The arrest would happen quickly and efficiently, but it would create exactly the kind of public scandal that would destroy David's reputation with his status-conscious clients. Margaret found herself thinking about Mrs. Delacroix's advice about revenge being served at room temperature. The temperature felt perfect. At exactly 9:15, Margaret saw Agent Martinez receive a signal on her own phone and begin moving toward their table. Other agents started converging from different directions, their movement coordinated but not yet obvious to the other guests. Isabella was still engaged in animated conversation, completely unaware that federal law enforcement was closing in on her position. David, meanwhile, was reaching into his jacket pocket for what Margaret knew was an engagement ring. His timing was impeccable. Isabella would be arrested just moments before he humiliated himself by proposing to a wanted fugitive. Margaret made a split-second decision that surprised her with its compassion. She reached across the table and placed her hand on David's arm, stopping him from retrieving the ring. "David," she said quietly, "before you do anything else, I think there's something you should know about Elena." The moment Margaret spoke Elena's real name, several things happened simultaneously. David's face went white as he realized that his wife knew about his affair. Isabella's head snapped up from her phone with the predatory alertness of someone who had just sensed danger. Agent Martinez accelerated her approach to their table while signaling the other agents to move into position. But it was Isabella who reacted first, and most decisively. "Excuse me," she said, standing gracefully and placing her napkin on the table. "I need to use the ladies' room." Margaret knew that Isabella was attempting to flee, probably having recognized Agent Martinez as law enforcement. Without thinking, Margaret stood as well. "I'll come with you," she said with a pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'd like to chat privately." The two women walked across the ballroom together, drawing curious glances from other guests who had noticed the subtle tension at their table. David remained frozen in his chair, still processing his wife's knowledge of the affair, and uncertain how to respond. In the hotel's elegant powder room, Margaret and Isabella faced each other alone for the first time since Margaret had discovered the truth about both women's identities. "So," Isabella said, dropping her social persona entirely, "how long have you known? About the affair? Months? About your real name and criminal background?" "Long enough." Isabella studied Margaret with professional interest. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "David described you as naive, emotional, and completely focused on your little job with sick children. He made you sound like someone who would never notice what was happening right under her nose." Margaret felt a flash of anger at hearing David's characterization of her, but she kept her voice steady. "David sees what he wants to see. Apparently so do you." "Fair enough." Isabella moved toward the mirror, ostensibly to check her appearance while actually positioning herself near the exit. "So what happens now? Are you going to confront your husband publicly? Make a scene about his affair?" "I don't need to make a scene, Isabella. Or should I call you Elena? Or maybe Isabella Marquez?" Isabella's hand froze halfway to her lipstick. "I don't know what you think you know. I know that you're wanted by the FBI for investment fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. I know that you've been using David's business to clean money stolen from your previous victims. I know that federal agents are positioned throughout this ballroom waiting to arrest you for crimes that could put you in prison for 20 years. Isabella's composure finally cracked. "You called the FBI? I didn't have to. They've been tracking you for months. David just happened to be unlucky enough to be your next victim." For the first time since Margaret had met her, Isabella looked genuinely surprised. "Victim? Did you think he knew what you were doing? David is many things. Selfish, shallow, weak, but he's not a criminal. He had no idea he was helping you launder money. He thought he was funding a romantic adventure with his sophisticated mistress." Isabella laughed with what sounded like genuine amusement. "Your husband was planning to steal your assets to pay for his new life with me. He was going to destroy your reputation in divorce court to justify taking everything you've worked for. How is that not criminal?" "It's awful," Margaret admitted. "But it's not federal money laundering. David is guilty of being a terrible husband and a foolish man, but he's not guilty of the crimes you've committed." Isabella studied Margaret with new respect. "So why are you warning me? You could have let the FBI arrest me at the table. Your husband would have been publicly humiliated when he tried to propose to a wanted fugitive. Instead, you're giving me a chance to escape." Margaret considered the question herself. She had planned this evening for weeks, orchestrating every detail to ensure maximum humiliation for David and justice for Isabella's crimes. But standing face to face with the woman who had systematically manipulated her husband, Margaret found her motivation was more complex than simple revenge. "I want you to face justice for your crimes," she said finally. "But I also want David to understand the full scope of his betrayal and its consequences. If you're arrested quietly, he might convince himself that he was just unlucky to get involved with the wrong woman. He needs to see how his choices led to this moment." Isabella nodded slowly. "You want him to know that his greed and selfishness made him the perfect mark for someone like me." "Exactly. And you want him to face consequences that are proportionate to his actions, serious enough to matter, but not severe enough to destroy him permanently." "He's not a good man anymore," Margaret said. "But he used to be, and maybe he can be again. That won't happen if he goes to federal prison, but it might happen if he loses everything he gained through betraying me." Isabella moved away from the mirror and sat on the elegant velvet bench in the center of the powder room. "You know, in 5 years of running cons, you're the first Mark's wife who figured out what I was doing. Most of them never even realize their husbands are having affairs, let alone that the other woman is a criminal. Most of them probably aren't nurses trained to notice when people aren't telling the truth about their symptoms." "Is that what gave me away?" "Partly. Your stories about different cities contained small factual errors. Your business was too vaguely described. You provided too much irrelevant detail while being evasive about important facts." Margaret paused. "But mostly, it was the way David talked about me in his text messages to you. I knew my husband was changing, but the man who wrote those messages wasn't the man I married. Anyone who could inspire that level of contempt and self-justification had to be offering him something more powerful than just sex and sophistication." "I offered him validation," Isabella said. "Men like David are desperate to believe they deserve better than what they have. I made him feel like he was settling for you when he could have someone like me. And you made him willing to steal from me to prove he deserved that better life. I made him willing to reveal who he really was when his values were tested by temptation." Margaret realized that Isabella was right. The con hadn't corrupted David so much as it had revealed the corruption that was already there. A truly good man might have been attracted to Isabella, but he wouldn't have been willing to betray his wife's trust and steal her assets to fund an affair. "The FBI is going to come looking for you soon," Margaret said. "What are you going to do?" Isabella stood and smoothed her dress. "I'm going to walk back into that ballroom, return to our table, and behave normally until they arrest me. Running would only make things worse, and besides," she smiled with something that looked like genuine warmth, "I'm curious to see how this plays out. You've orchestrated something quite sophisticated here, Mrs. Kellerman. I'd hate to miss the finale." "It's Chen," Margaret corrected. "Margaret Chen. I think I'm done being Mrs. Kellerman." The two women returned to the ballroom together, drawing even more attention from other guests who sensed something dramatic was unfolding. David was still sitting at their table, but he had moved his chair closer to Victoria Whitmore and was engaged in what looked like an intense, whispered conversation. Margaret realized that David was trying to control the narrative, probably telling Victoria that his wife had discovered his affair and was behaving irrationally. He was positioning himself as the wronged party, the successful man whose unstable wife was causing a scene at an important business event. But as Margaret and Isabella approached the table, Agent Martinez and 3 other FBI agents converged from different directions. The arrest was swift, professional, and devastatingly public. "Isabella Marquez," Agent Martinez said, displaying her badge and speaking clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. "You're under arrest for federal charges of investment fraud, money laundering, and identity theft." The ballroom fell silent as Isabella was handcuffed and read her rights. Margaret watched David's face cycle through confusion, shock, recognition, and finally, devastating comprehension. He understood in that moment that his sophisticated mistress was actually a wanted criminal, that his investment accounts had been used for money laundering, and that his affair had made him an unwitting accomplice in federal crimes. But the full scope of his humiliation was still unfolding. Agent Martinez turned to David with an expression of professional courtesy. "Mr. Kellerman, we need to speak with you about your business relationship with Ms. Marquez. You're not under arrest, but we strongly recommend that you contact an attorney before answering any questions." Victoria Whitmore and the other clients at their table stared at David with expressions of horror and disgust. In their social circle, being associated with federal crime was infinitely worse than simple marital infidelity. David had not only betrayed his wife, but had potentially compromised his client's investments through his involvement with a known criminal. Margaret watched David realize that his entire professional world was crumbling along with his personal life. The clients he had worked so hard to impress were already calculating how quickly they could move their accounts to other firms. The social status he had sacrificed his marriage to achieve was disappearing in real time. As Isabella was escorted from the ballroom, she paused next to Margaret's chair. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "you deserved better than him." After the FBI and Isabella had left, Margaret found herself sitting alone at a table with David and 6 people who were desperately trying to process what they had just witnessed. The charity gala continued around them, but their corner of the ballroom had become a pocket of shocked silence. David turned to Margaret with an expression of desperate confusion. "Margaret, I don't understand what just happened. Elena, Isabella, whoever she is. I had no idea she was a criminal. You have to believe me." "I do believe you," Margaret said calmly. "You were a victim, David. A willing victim who was happy to betray his wife for a woman he barely knew, but a victim nonetheless. I never meant for any of this to happen. The affair, the money transfers. I thought I was protecting our future, building something better for both of us." Margaret looked at her husband, the man who had systematically humiliated her for months while planning to steal her assets, and felt something that was neither anger nor sympathy. It was more like exhaustion, as if she had been carrying a heavy weight for so long that she had forgotten how tired it made her. "David, you were planning to divorce me. Tonight, after proposing to a woman you met 8 months ago." The table fell silent again, as David's colleagues processed this additional layer of betrayal. Not only had David endangered his business by getting involved with a criminal, but he had been conducting an affair while planning to publicly humiliate his wife. How long have you known?" "Long enough to protect myself," Margaret said. "Long enough to make sure that when your choices caught up with you, I wouldn't be destroyed along with you." David's business partner, James Morrison, leaned across the table with an expression of professional concern. "David, exactly how much money are we talking about? How much did you transfer to this woman's accounts?" Margaret watched David calculate the financial damage in real time. His face went white as he realized the scope of his losses. "Almost $2 million, he said quietly. "Most of our joint savings, the house equity line, and..." He paused, looking sick. "Some client funds that I moved to high-yield accounts," she recommended. The table erupted in horrified whispers. David hadn't just been conned out of his personal money. He had potentially embezzled client funds to support his affair with a criminal. Even if the FBI cleared him of intentional wrongdoing, his professional reputation was destroyed. Margaret felt a moment of genuine pity for David. He had gambled everything: his marriage, his reputation, his clients' trust, his financial security, on a relationship with a woman who had been systematically destroying his life from their first meeting. But her pity was tempered by the memory of months of calculated cruelty and his willingness to steal from her to fund his betrayal. Victoria Whitmore was the first to break the shocked silence. "David, I think Charles and I need to discuss moving our account to another firm. This is..." She gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them. "This is not the kind of situation we can be associated with." The other clients at the table nodded in agreement. Margaret realized she was witnessing the complete destruction of David's professional life in real time. By morning, news of his arrest-adjacent status and financial losses would spread throughout Boston's investment community. His business would be finished regardless of whether he faced criminal charges. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the garden behind her new apartment in Cambridge, tending the vegetables and flowers she had transplanted from the house she had once shared with David. The divorce had been finalized quickly, once David realized that Margaret had documented everything and that fighting would only increase his legal expenses while he faced potential federal prosecution. Margaret had kept the house initially, but ultimately decided to sell it and move somewhere that held no memories of her failed marriage. The Cambridge apartment was smaller, but filled with light, and it was walking distance from both the hospital and her parents' restaurant. She had used her share of the house sale to pay off her student loans completely and establish an emergency fund that would ensure she never again found herself financially vulnerable to another person's poor decisions. David had avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating fully with the FBI and providing evidence about Isabella's methods. He had been forced to pay significant civil penalties and had lost his investment advisor license pending a thorough investigation of his business practices. James Morrison had dissolved their partnership and started a new firm without David's involvement. David was currently working as a junior associate at a small financial planning firm, making roughly 1/3 of his previous salary and living in a studio apartment near his office. Margaret had heard through mutual acquaintances that David was attending therapy and had expressed genuine remorse for his treatment of her during their marriage. She hoped that was true, but she had no desire to verify it personally. Their divorce had included a clause requiring minimal contact, and Margaret found that she preferred it that way. Isabella Marquez had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges related to defrauding multiple victims across 5 states. During her trial, it was revealed that she had stolen more than $8 million over her criminal career and had used men like David as unwitting accomplices in complex money laundering schemes. Margaret had testified briefly about discovering Isabella's true identity, and the prosecutor had praised her investigation work as crucial to building their case. The most unexpected outcome of Margaret's revenge had been the strengthening of her relationships with colleagues and friends who had witnessed her grace under pressure. Dr. Peterson had been particularly supportive during the divorce proceedings, and their friendship had deepened into something Margaret valued enormously. Even some of David's former clients, particularly the women, had reached out to express their admiration for Margaret's handling of the situation and their regret for not recognizing David's poor character sooner. Margaret's work at the hospital had taken on new meaning as she rebuilt her life. Her experience with David's deception had made her even more attuned to patients and families who were dealing with situations where trust had been betrayed. She had started a support group for families dealing with pediatric cancer, drawing on her own experience of surviving systematic emotional manipulation to help others navigate medical crises that tested their relationships. Mrs. Rose Delacroix had become one of Margaret's closest friends, and they met for coffee every Sunday to discuss everything from gardening to criminal psychology. Mrs. Delacroix had expressed professional admiration for Margaret's investigation techniques and had jokingly suggested she consider a career change to private investigation. On this particular evening, as Margaret watered her tomato plants and watched the sun set over Cambridge, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. A year earlier, she had been married to a man who saw her as an embarrassment and was planning to steal from her to fund his affair with a criminal. Now she was financially secure, professionally respected, and surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Peterson. "New case coming in tomorrow. 8-year-old with a rare genetic condition. Thought you'd want to know." Margaret smiled and typed back, "I'll be ready." As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret found an envelope that had been slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a note written in elegant handwriting. "Margaret, I heard about your successful recovery from the situation with David and wanted to congratulate you on your new beginning. Your investigation skills were impressive, and I suspect this isn't the last time you'll solve problems that others can't. If you ever decide you're tired of nursing, I know some people who could use your particular talents. Best wishes, Rose." Margaret laughed and added the note to the box where she kept mementos from this chapter of her life. She had no intention of leaving nursing, but it was nice to know she had options. And that's how justice was served. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses. Margaret's patience and careful planning ensured that both David and Isabella faced consequences perfectly matched to their crimes. David lost the status and wealth he had been willing to betray his wife to achieve, while Isabella faced federal prosecution for the money laundering scheme she had orchestrated through his business.